planet's on fire. It's a real code red. Got us by the balls, we're being slowly bled. All the swollen puppet head, the propagandized, fake chocolate points, flat out lies. A house full of mirrors, it's a lousy reflection. Run hard left, it's a true direction. Democracy's in trouble, this news isn't fake. Everything we fought for was truly at stake. Border to border, coast to coast, it's time to cue the talent and meet our host. It's podcast by George. All right, folks, it's showtime.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. Well, this is a big one for me. This is a special edition of Podcast by George. We've got a journalism hero on the podcast today, and we're talking about a topic that everyone knows is very near and dear to my heart, and it's Julian Assange. You know, when I started the podcast, I thought, okay, I'm going to talk about Assange. I'm going to go out and talk to some of these journalism people that I've known my entire life and talk about this. Well, it's not easy to get even journalism people to talk about Julian Assange, but this guy will, and I'm just glad to have him on the podcast today. It's Kevin Gosztola. He's the managing editor of shadowproof.com, and by way of information, Shadowproof is a press organization driven to expose systemic abuses of power in business and government while developing a model for independent journalism, folks, that supports a diverse range of young freelance writers and contributors, particularly from marginalized communities. And my God, do we need that now more than ever? Let's welcome him on in. Kevin, welcome to a podcast by George.
Yep. Thanks. Journalism for the little people and not the defense contractors. We can say amen to that.
Yeah, they've got plenty of power. They don't need a boost. But folks like Podcast by George do. And this particular story that you've been all over for a number of years just kind of leapt to the front pages here in the past couple of days. I got lucky getting Kevin to come on the podcast to talk about this. But Kevin, I just want to lay kind of a thumbnail down here, my basic understanding of the Assange situation, and then you can quickly fill in the gaps and expand upon it if necessary. Because believe it or not, a lot of people still are not aware of the plight of Julian Assange. And this is the way I describe it, and you would know whether or not I'm correct in this. But, you know, going way back in 2007, there's an Apache helicopter attack in Baghdad, and a video is made of it, and it's released by Chelsea Manning. It's leaked. Assange publishes that in 2010. It's a war crime, folks. I mean, you can go to YouTube and you can check this thing out. Well, Assange gets charged with espionage, basically. My understanding is for the release of that video, which is what it is. And Chelsea Manning is intrinsically involved in all of this. And Assange is still rotting in a prison in London because of that Apache helicopter video. And the irony of it from a journalism standpoint is there's not that much coverage, which infuriates me. And 2 Reuters journalists were killed in this helicopter attack. I mean, journalists ought to be all over this thing and continuing to cover it, God, every day almost, but they're not. So, and there's more to it than that, obviously. But Kevin, is that fundamental, right?
Yeah, you've got most of the basic details. And I would also say that there's no reason why you should be afraid that you don't have everything correct. Because like you say, the media is not covering it regularly enough for people to be all that familiar with every single different detail. You'd have to know that people like me and other alternative journalists are digging into this on a daily basis and know where to find that work. Because remember, there's algorithms on Google and there's all kinds of different ways that they can suppress that so that you're not actually finding this information that you would want to know about Julian Assange. And so what I would add to what you're saying is there's the Apache helicopter attack video. People might have seen it. It was uploaded as collateral murder video. But also what the US government really doesn't like is that WikiLeaks published these war log documents that showed the Afghanistan war and the Iraq war. It gave really minute detail. These were incident reports that showed what was happening on the ground in both of those wars. We also had files on Guantanamo prisoners, The U.S. government doesn't really like that the public learned that, the vast majority of those people that were brought to that military prison were brought on fabricated intelligence. They really weren't the most dangerous men in the world or the worst of the worst, like Donald Rumsfeld claimed. They were maybe 1% to 2% were actually bad people that could have been put on trial for terrorism. But the others were just, a lot of wrong place, wrong time kind of fellas. And so all of these different sets of documents, and in particular, what we'll get to today is when we talk about the CIA, what they're furious about is that WikiLeaks published these files called the Vault 7 materials. And when you're talking about coverage of WikiLeaks and their documents, that's something that got extremely little coverage. So people don't really even know that WikiLeaks published these documents that showed that the CIA had offensive cyber warfare capabilities, and they were targeting and could put malware, or they could hack into people's personal electronics. They could get into your Samsung television, all kinds of crazy things that the WikiLeaks showed they were able to do.
I want to get into that reporting because you were all over this a couple of years ago. I know there's been some details added to it, as I understand, since then. But I also wanted to just go back in time a little bit to, again, people wonder, why am I so uptight about Assange? Well, my journalism career, my education began really in the post-Joseph McCarthy era, basically. That's what my journalism professors were still talking about. And the Vietnam War occurred, and then we had the Pentagon Papers, for God's sake. Daniel Ellsberg was the leaker that got that information into the public domain via publishers like the Washington Post and the New York Times, and it brought about a quicker end to the Vietnam War, we believe. 50,000 plus dead Americans in that war, not to count, my God, maybe 1 million people in Vietnam and Cambodia. That war was expanding. It was growing. The count could have continued. But thanks to Daniels Ellsberg and those publishers, that was ended. Well, here comes Julian Assange, and I look at this, and he releases these war logs like you're talking about, and these Middle East wars that have just proven to be fabricated and under false pretense, like Iraq, and worthless like Afghanistan. And the guy is sitting in a prison for publishing this in London still, and charged with espionage. And the original incident that Kevin delineated here isn't even mentioned in the espionage charges that they're holding him on, I believe. And the key guy that the government was relying on to provide testimony for these charges is a proven liar, and has since admitted that he lied in his testimony that's got Assange still in jail, right?
Yeah. This guy, his name's Ziggy Todarson. He's a pedophile. He preys on underage boys. And this is who the FBI is working with or particularly under President Donald Trump, this is who the FBI turned to dress up their case and make it seem like they had more to go after Assange. Because what they want us to believe is that Julian Assange is a hacker and not a journalist. So they needed to get somebody who could tell them the things that they needed for their indictment, and say that Julian was actually trying to hack into government agencies or maybe help with going after banking institutions. But none of that's true.
Well, and it's all deeply rooted in politics here in America. Obviously, our two political parties, I'm left of the Democratic Party. A lot of people would look at it and say, well, why aren't the Democrats sympathetic to Assange? Well, he published those emails, that DNC trove of information that implicated the DNC in the Bernie Sanders fiasco in 2016. So they don't like him. They're not going to help him at all. They've got it out for him. They wanted to try to blame that on hacking by the Russians, which their own investigative agency, CrowdStrike, has since come on the record and said they found no evidence of that. So that was bogus. But then the Republicans, they don't have any love for Julian Assange either. And I thought, well, why not? I mean, he revealed that information about the Democrats and the DNC. Donald Trump ought to love Julian Assange. And I used to think, Kevin, that he didn't, because I heard that Assange put out an all call at one time for people that might have information on Trump's taxes to come forward with that, and that he was publishing that information if and when it was becoming available, and so Trump hated him. But it looks like it's even worse than that, and that brings us up to the present day with this reporting in Yahoo News going back to some stuff that you found out 2 years ago. Now, again, clarify if I'm not completely correct in what I've just said.
No, you've got it all correct. So to take people back to April 2017, CIA Director Mike Pompeo, who is a major Republican figure right now. This is a person who, well, he went on to be the Secretary of State under Donald Trump, but he's hoping to run for president, we believe.
He's already been to Iowa. He's been here.
Yeah. So he's putting himself out there, and he was obsessed with Julian Assange. This reporting confirms that, but we know because in one of his first major speeches for the CIA, or as CIA director, he stood before the world and went after WikiLeaks, went after Julian Assange. The whole speech was built around saying that WikiLeaks is a non-state hostile intelligence agency, which we now know from this Yahoo News report, which has some really incredible stuff in it. And it's great work. It's rare to find mainstream organizations that do this kind of journalism, but when it does happen, we're thankful that it's available and widely available to everyone. And what it indicates is that this designation was very deliberate, because they believed that by designating WikiLeaks as a hostile organization, they would then have the legal justification to go after WikiLeaks and target it for disruption. And then they could also proceed to discuss things that really take you back. When you talk about your history as a journalist, I imagine when you look at some of this, it takes you back to the late 1960s and 1970s when the CIA had things, I believe they're called like the family jewels. They were talking about assassinating world leaders.
Castro,
yeah. There were so many wild and crazy plots about taking out Fidel Castro. And it looks like they maybe had just as many scenarios for taking out and eliminating Julian Assange, or assassinating him. And then they're also talking about rendition flights. They're talking about putting Julian Assange, kidnapping him from the Ecuador embassy in London, putting him on a plane and flying into the US, much like they put terrorism suspects on planes and put them in secret black site prisons and took them then on to Guantanamo Bay after they were done torturing them. They're talking about doing that to a publisher and bringing him to the US.
Clarify, Kevin, what is rendition? I mean, that's just a nice term for something else.
It was really abduction, like it's really, and I don't know, maybe rendition is, you're right. It sounds fairly clean for what goes through. What happens when you are put through this? I mean, people show up in clad in gear, and they'll maybe strip you down naked. They'll put a hood over your head. They'll tie you down to the bed of an aircraft, or they'll put goggles on your face and earmuffs over you so that you have no idea where you are, where they're taking you. And then they'll whisk you off to some location, and usually it's for interrogation. But if they already have everything they need on Julian Assange, then in this case, it would have been to bring him to U.S. soil so he could finally be charged with crimes, or I don't know. Actually, I guess we don't know that it's out of the realm of possibility that the CIA would have tried to secretly interrogate Assange if they got their hands on him.
Mm-mm. Well, and this Yahoo reporting with the details that I had up on the screen earlier, they're delineating here that they were actively and seriously, apparently, I mean, this wasn't like locker room joke stuff. They were talking about kidnapping Assange, going through this rendition procedure, and possibly assassinating him, for God's sake. Now, this is the CIA, and Kevin mentioned Mike Pompeo. This is the guy that is on tape again, and I've had this on the show before, saying when we were with the CIA, when he was the head of it, we lied, we cheated, and we stole. That's what these guys do at the least, and at the most is they kidnap, exercise rendition, and kill people. I mean, this was under discussion with the Trump uh, administration, and fortunately he didn't do it. But I guess I would stand back and look at this, Kevin, and I say, okay, do you believe Assange or you believe the government? Here's proven what the government did. Here's Assange over here who did nothing but just publish information. My God, why would he be sitting in a prison in London?
Yes, because he's upset this agency greatly. And it says in the report that they were embarrassed by the publication of the Vault 7 materials. And,
Yes.
and why are they embarrassed? Because privately, they had laughed at the Pentagon because they were not able to keep their files safe on the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. And privately, and I did not mention this set of documents, they laughed at the State Department because over 250,000 diplomatic cables were made public about U.S. worldwide diplomacy and their relations with governments throughout the world and what they do, the way they carry out business. So they laughed. They said the State Department can't take care of its own files. And then they were targeted. And then WikiLeaks was laughing at them because they lost control of 9,000 of these files. And again, I tell you, exposed cyber warfare tools that the CIA uses against countries that are considered our adversaries, but also in ways that I think we would agree should probably have much, much more oversight. And we should be able to debate whether we think our government should be engaged in those kinds of attacks on personal devices and on electronics. And so that's why they are talking about assassinating Assange. They didn't like that he helped Edward Snowden get to safety. Edward Snowden was in Hong Kong and he didn't have a way out, and they helped assist him to get on an airplane to leave. And eventually, of course, he became stuck in the Moscow airport. We know from a lot of reporting and coverage that President Joe Biden was involved in the conversations with governments, including Ecuador, to make sure he didn't make it onto a Latin American country. I think he also kept him from being able to go to Cuba. So he's ended up stuck in Moscow, but WikiLeaks people were helping to make that possible. And then when that happened, the Obama administration said, well, we no longer feel like WikiLeaks is off limits as far as this. We had talked about a First Amendment problem. We said we're not going to prosecute Julian Assange because it would make editors of newspapers vulnerable to prosecutions. But now that he's assisted Edward Snowden, we changed our minds. We're going to let the CIA go back to collecting data on WikiLeaks. We're going to let them go back to total surveillance of WikiLeaks. They can now, and then the CIA takes it upon themselves to start targeting and going after WikiLeaks staff members as well as Assange. And there's a private security company named Undercover Global that is at the Ecuador embassy helping the CIA get round-the-clock video footage and audio from within the embassy of not just Assange, but also his legal team as they're trying to sort through all the things that they need to deal with the human rights abuses that are chronic.
Outrageous. And of course, as I mentioned, a lot of this you were reporting on and following a couple of years ago. Now and I said we're lucky to have Kevin on this morning, actually, because they're after him today to get him on programs because he played a key role in this investigating a couple of years ago. What are you underlining or emphasizing in the interviews that you're doing today when it comes to this reporting from Yahoo?
Well, yeah, so I didn't have the story. I just knew the narrative. I understood that Mike Pompeo and the CIA were upset over these Vault 7 materials, which nobody was talking about that much. And it when you talked about the indictment of Julian Assange, it was not ever presented as the reason why Julian Assange is being prosecuted because the CIA wanted to nail him. And I think we can see clearly now that they really the genesis of these criminal charges against Julian Assange are owed to the fact that the CIA wanted Julian Assange to be eliminated, to be killed. And so then we look further down in the report, and if it's a very long article, but if you get to the last section, it's revealed that the Justice Department and people within the National Security Council in the Trump administration are afraid of what's going to happen next. They think at any moment the CIA might mount some kind of operation that'll get out of hand. You know, that article's talking about how there could be a shootout outside of the Ecuador embassy with like spies from the different European countries or from Britain even shooting. And they're afraid that like Russia's going to spirit Julian Assange from the embassy. It's really wild.
Well, it sounds crazy, but Bay of Pigs. I mean, it's not that crazy when you consider what the CIA has done before.
So the Justice Department is really concerned that something bad's going to happen, and they decide that they're going to rush to indict Julian Assange because if they can charge him and get him in jail, get him away from the embassy, then he'll be safe from the clutches of the CIA. It's a really perverse way to think about it, but I mean, I guess Julian is safer in that respect because the CIA is not going to get to him when he's in Belmarsh. But at the same time, he shouldn't be in jail because he's only there since the British government gave him this bail jumping charge. And we learn also from this reporting that the bail jumping charge is a product of agreeing to do this for the US government. In other words, all along, they've criminalized Julian Assange for saying he was in fear for his safety. He needed to seek asylum from Ecuador. And they treat him like a political, they treat him like a fugitive. And, you know, in reality, he's a political prisoner and he should not be in jail, especially since he won his extradition case. And that's something we need to be really clear about as we wrap up this interview. He won back in January. A judge said that the US government did not have grounds to extradite him because if he was extradited to the US, it would be oppressive for mental and physical health reasons. And they haven't been able to, I think, come up with anything to rebut that. They're going to try some conniving ways within the courtroom. There's an appeal on October 27th that I'll be covering. They're going to try to use, their weasel words in order to say that Julian Assange and everything that his lawyers are saying should not be taken seriously by this high court of justice, this appeals court. But I don't know that they're going to really get a whole lot of traction because there is precedent actually in the UK to protect somebody who has these kinds of issues. And it's just sad that he's still in jail, that he developed some of these ailments and they've got worse as a result of him being in the embassy and in jail. But yeah, there's just so much here. It's overwhelming. And there really isn't enough coverage out there in the media because you could spend just about every day of the week talking about something new related to the Assange case, especially since the charges have not been dropped. And I do think it's really shameful that the Biden administration won't own this. Anytime journalists ask them about this, they won't go on the record and comment. They won't defend it. They don't feel like it's defensible. So they just tell journalists that they're not going to answer their questions.
Well, and I'm the ultimate cynic. I look at it and I think the reason that they want to hold Assange down and keep him in prison is because what he revealed, if that gets, more light of day, so to speak, there's a lot of implication there. There's a lot of people that could be go down and be harmed by that in the government, and particularly the British government. People forget about that. They were our primary ally over there. Let's talk about those war crimes in the Middle East. I mean, they were in league in tandem with the United States on that. So I look at it, Kevin, and think, are they just playing games over there, those courts? Are they just going to keep him in prison on whatever technicality they can, maybe for the rest of his life? And as we leave this show, I want to kind of get your feel because, again, you're an expert on this and you've been covering it for years. Do you have any guess as to what's going to happen next?
So I waffle between optimism that's cautious and based in reality, and then the cynicism that you're feeling. And I think after this kind of this report on the CIA, it's very easy to feel like there's nobody that's going to speak up for Julian Assange in government and bring a halt to this. But I do think that his legal team, again, they're in the winning position. There's a lot that the U.S. government has to prove to the High Court of Justice in order to get the decision in the lower court reversed. It's not beyond the realm of possibility, but it's going to take a lot of work, I think, on the part of the Crown Prosecution Service, which is in the UK and tasked with carrying forward the US's arguments. What I'm most concerned about, though, is that the Biden administration has come up with a timeline where they are perfectly willing to let this keep going until the Supreme Court level and until the final stage. And that's when it's rejected. Or even if at the Supreme Court level in the UK, they get an authorization for an extradition request, they'll just say, well, we won. We got what we wanted, but we're not going to bring Julian Assange to the US because we've now recognized that the world is against us and we're not going to do this because it would do damage to our image. And I suppose what I'm saying is the Biden administration strikes me as this group of people that would like to just prove a point and play with Julian Assange's life and let him continue to go through this misery and this harassment and the destruction to his life. He has a family. We haven't mentioned that yet. He has a partner and he's got 2 children, and he can't be with them. And they're going through the most formative years of their life right now. These are kids who are, they're toddlers, and he can't be with them as a father. And I think they're fine to leave him in this legal limbo because I think that is just as good as bringing him to the United States and putting him on trial.
We got to let him go. We're running out of time, and I just listened to those things, and bringing him back to the United States, as Kevin talked about. My God, he's not an American citizen.
No, yeah, I shouldn't talk like that because you're right. He's an Australian, and actually, he's never really been here. I mean, I think he may have made like 1 or 2 trips in his lifetime, but wow. He's got no ties whatsoever to the United States.
Wow, that's just unbelievable. We're just out of time. I want to bring him back again at some future point, and I hope you've enjoyed listening. He's a journalism hero of mine. I got to say this, particularly when you see him on screen next to my old Gummer profile. He's not as young as he looks. He's kind of a Paul McCartney type dude. Kevin's a young-looking guy, but he's been all over this case for a number of years now, and he's just an excellent independent journalist out there doing the work and spreading the word that we all need to get. I'm just delighted to have him on Podcast by George. Kevin, before we leave, tell people how to contact you, where to follow you, your Twitter handle, all that kind of stuff.
Well, sure. The thing I'll give is I do a newsletter called The Dissenter. It's at thedissenter.org, DISSENTER.org. It's a free newsletter, but that's where I send out all the updates and the information about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And then I do other whistleblower stories. I do coverage of their cases as well. So if people want more of that and like what they heard, or I mean, I don't see how you could like what you've heard, but if you're into this subject matter, then become a subscriber. And of course, I'm on Twitter at Gosztola. So thank you, George.
Yeah, oh yeah, Kevin Gosztola, managing editor of shadowproof.com. Thanks again for coming on Podcast by George. That's going to do it, folks. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is for this particular edition of the podcast. Now, if you want to follow us, go to podcastbygeorge.com. Pick the platform that you'd like to subscribe to, and it's easy. You'll be notified of each new episode when it comes out. But that's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.